He had nothing left. No ranch, no money, and a daughter whose fear had stolen her voice. Then a lawyer handed him keys to a collapsing stable and a wild horse nobody could touch. Travis Brennan thought it was the final insult from an uncle who'd never cared. But when midnight began pawing at the earth under a full moon, leading him to places no map showed, Travis realized some inheritances aren't measured in dollars. What lay hidden beneath Broken Pine Ranch would force him to choose between survival and something far more dangerous. The truth. A truth powerful men had buried decades ago and would kill to keep silent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind across northeastern Wyoming carried the smell of dust and defeat. Travis Brennan sat in his truck outside the law office in Sheridan Falls, engine ticking as it cooled, hands still gripping the wheel though he'd been parked for 10 minutes. Through the windshield he could see the painted letters on the glass door, faded gold leaf spelling out names of attorneys who'd probably never missed a mortgage payment in their lives. His phone buzzed again. The same number. The bank in Billings where he'd lost everything 6 months ago. Travis let it ring through to voicemail. They'd already taken the ranch, the equipment, even the truck he'd driven since his rodeo days. This borrowed Ford with its cracked dashboard and check engine light was courtesy of his ex-wife's brother, who'd made it clear the loan came with an expiration date. In the passenger seat, Lily traced patterns on the foggy window with one finger. She hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. Not since the anniversary of the accident. Her therapist said it was selective mutism, a trauma response, something that might pass with time and patience. Travis had patience. What he didn't have was time or the money for more therapy sessions. The letter had arrived 4 days ago, forwarded 3 times before finding him at the motel where they'd been staying. Thin paper, official letterhead, words that made no sense at first. His uncle, a man he'd met maybe twice in his childhood, had died. Complications from pneumonia, the letter said, though Travis suspected whiskey had done most of the work. And somehow, inexplicably, the old man had left everything to Travis. Not that everything amounted to much, according to the attorney's carefully worded phone call. Property in Clearwater Basin. Some structures. An animal that came with certain conditions. Travis had almost laughed when he heard that part. Conditions. As if he was in any position to be picky about conditions. He pushed open the truck door, the hinges screaming in protest. Lily looked up at him, her eyes the same shade of brown as her mother's, and he felt the familiar punch of grief mixed with inadequacy. 10 years old, and she'd already learned that the world could betray you without warning. Her mother's car sliding on black ice. The phone call in the middle of the night. The funeral where Travis had stood holding Lily's small hand. Both of them too shocked to cry. After that came the downward spiral he couldn't stop. Medical bills from the accident. His own injury acting up, the vertebrae in his lower back grinding bone on bone every time he tried to work. Missing too many days at the ranch he'd managed up in Billings. Then missing payroll. Then the loans he couldn't cover. Then the foreclosure notice taped to his door like a death sentence. Inside the law office, the air conditioning was set too cold and smelled like old coffee. The receptionist, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, glanced up with the kind of professional sympathy that made Travis feel even more transparent. She knew exactly what he was. Another broke cowboy with nothing left but a battered hat and failing pride. The attorney, Douglas Marsh, was younger than Travis expected. Probably hadn't turned 40 yet. He stood when they entered, extending a hand across a desk stacked with manila folders and faded property surveys. His handshake was firm but brief, the grip of someone who touched poor people all day and had learned not to linger. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for coming in." Marsh gestured to 2 chairs opposite his desk. "And this must be Lily." Lily said nothing, as Travis knew she wouldn't. She climbed into the chair and pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around her shins. Travis had tried everything. Gentle encouragement, bribery with ice cream, even anger, which he regretted immediately. Nothing worked. The words were locked somewhere inside her, and he didn't have the key. Marsh shuffled papers, clearing his throat. "Your uncle, Raymond Brennan, passed 6 weeks ago. He had no other living relatives that we could locate, which is why the estate comes to you. I'll be honest, Mr. Brennan, it's not much of an estate. The property is 200 acres outside Clearwater Basin. The structures are in significant disrepair. There's no active income, no livestock beyond 1 horse, and property taxes are 3 years delinquent. Travis felt something cold settle in his stomach. How much are the back taxes? 16,000, give or take. He actually did laugh then, a short bitter sound. I don't have $16,000. I don't have $1,600. Marsh nodded as if he'd expected this. There's time before the county moves to auction. 6 months, maybe more if you file the right paperwork. And there's another element you should know about. He pulled a photograph from one of the folders and slid it across the desk. The image was grainy, printed on cheap paper, but clear enough. A black horse stood in a corral, head high, ears pinned back. Even in the photo, Travis could see the wildness in its posture, the tension coiled in every muscle. A white blaze ran down its face like lightning frozen in place. This is Midnight, your uncle's horse. According to his will, the animal must remain with the property. It cannot be sold, surrendered, or relocated. If you accept the inheritance, you accept responsibility for the horse. Travis stared at the photo. A wild horse on land he couldn't afford to keep with taxes he couldn't pay. It was almost funny. Almost. What if I refuse the inheritance? Marsh closed the folder. Then the county takes it all. The land goes to auction, likely purchased by whoever holds the surrounding leases. The horse goes to the Bureau of Land Management. They'll try to auction him, but at his age and temperament, he'll probably end up in a kill pen heading for the border. Something about that last part made Travis's jaw tighten. He thought about his own rodeo days, the horses he'd ridden and respected. The idea of any horse ending up in a slaughter truck because nobody wanted the trouble of caring for it sat wrong in his gut. Lily had gone very still in her chair, staring at the photograph. Her finger reached out slowly, not quite touching the paper, tracing the outline of the horse's head. Can we see it? Travis heard himself ask. The property, Marsh seemed surprised. It's an hour-and-a-half drive. Place is pretty rough. No electricity, well pumps broken, roof's half gone on the stable. We've got time. The attorney studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll draw up the preliminary papers. You'll need to sign acceptance of the estate to take possession, but you can tour the property first. He pulled out a key ring with 2 old brass keys attached. Main gate and the bunkhouse. The stable doesn't lock anymore. Travis took the keys. They were heavy and warm from sitting in the desk drawer, worn smooth by decades of use. As they stood to leave, Marsh added one more thing. Your uncle was a difficult man, Mr. Brennan. Kept to himself, didn't trust easily. But people around Clearwater Basin respected him. Said he had principles even if they made his life harder. I don't know if that means preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Anything to you? But I thought you should know. Outside, the afternoon sun hit like a hammer. Travis helped Lily into the truck, her small frame seeming even more fragile in the vast Wyoming landscape. As he started the engine, she finally looked at him. Didn't speak, but her eyes asked the question. I don't know, sweetheart. I honestly don't know. The drive northwest took them through country that got emptier with every mile. Past Sheridan Falls with its struggling downtown, past ranches flying flags from mailbox posts, past signs advertising land for sale that had been standing so long the paint had blistered away. The Bighorn Mountains rose in the distance, still holding snow on the highest peaks even in late August. Clearwater Basin, when they reached it, was barely a town. A feed store, a gas station, a post office that doubled as a general store. Maybe 20 houses scattered across the flats, half of them looking abandoned. Travis stopped at the gas station to fill up and ask directions, though the GPS had already led them most of the way. The attendant, an old man with skin like worn leather, nodded when Travis mentioned Broken Pine Ranch. Oh, Ray's place. Heard he passed. Shame. He was one of the good ones. He gave directions involving landmarks instead of street names. Past the big cottonwood. Left at the dry creek. Keep going till you see the busted windmill. You knew my uncle? Known of him. He didn't come to town much, but when he did, people listened. Had a way of seeing through bull. The old man squinted at Travis. You planning to keep the place? Haven't decided yet. The man just nodded, like he'd heard that before, and turned back to his register. The final stretch of road was barely more than 2 ruts worn into hardpan. The truck bounced through potholes, suspension groaning. Then the fence line appeared, barbed wire sagging between posts weathered to silver. The gate hung crooked on its hinges. The wood crossbar cracked straight through the middle. Travis got out and used one of the brass keys, though the padlock was so rusted it barely needed unlocking. The chain fell away in his hands, lynx orange with corrosion. He pushed the gate open, wood scraping across stone, and drove through. The stable appeared first, a long, low structure that might have been red once but now was the color of dried blood and ash. Half the roof had collapsed inward, timbers jutting up like broken ribs. The walls leaned at angles that shouldn't have been possible, held up by stubbornness and habit more than engineering. Beside it stood a smaller building the bunkhouse Marsh had mentioned. Its roof was intact at least, though the windows were dark and empty as dead eyes. Travis cut the engine. In the sudden silence he could hear wind moving through the collapsed stable, a low moan that sounded almost alive. Lily pressed closer to the window, breath fogging the glass. Stay in the truck for a minute, okay? Let me look around first. She nodded, pulling her jacket tighter even though the cab was still warm. Travis stepped out onto land that crunched under his boots. Everything was dry here, baked by sun and starved for water. Sagebrush grew in twisted clumps between exposed rock. A rusted water trough sat overturned near the stable, its sides buckled. Scattered across the yard were the remains of equipment slowly being reclaimed by the earth. An old harrow with weeds growing through its teeth. A wheelbarrow with no wheel. Coils of wire and rotted rope. He walked toward the stable, boot heels echoing in the emptiness. Up close the damage was even worse. The support beams had been chewed by time and weather, some split clean through. Inside he could see collapsed stalls, the separating walls torn down or fallen. Hay bales gone to dust. A rusted shovel leaning against what remained of a tack wall. And then he saw the horse. Midnight stood in the far corner where the roof was still mostly intact, positioned in the only patch of shade the structure offered. The black coat was dusty, but the animal was bigger than Travis expected. Easily 16 hands, with the muscled quarters of a horse bred for endurance. The white blaze down his face stood out stark against the darkness of his coat. But it was the eyes that stopped Travis cold. The horse was watching him with an intensity that felt almost human. Not fear, not aggression exactly, but a kind of fierce intelligence that made Travis suddenly aware of being measured and found uncertain. Easy there, Travis said quietly, though he made no move to approach. I'm not here to hurt you. The horse didn't move, didn't blink. Just watched with those dark eyes while the wind moved through the stable and somewhere in the distance a bird called out sharp and lonely. Travis backed away slowly, giving the animal space. As he turned toward the bunkhouse, he could feel those eyes still on him, tracking his movement across the yard. The bunkhouse door opened with a groan. Inside was a single room maybe 20 feet square. An iron bed frame with a bare mattress sat against one wall. A potbelly stove squatted in the corner, pipe extending through the roof. A small table, 2 chairs, a counter with a basin but no running water. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that turned the air gray when Travis stepped inside. But it had a roof. It had walls. It was shelter, which was more than they had anywhere else. He walked back to the truck where Lily waited. When he opened her door, she looked up at him with a question in her eyes. It's rough, Travis admitted. Real rough. No power, no water that I can see. But there's a place we could stay while I figure things out. He hesitated. There's also a horse. A wild one. We'd have to be careful around him. Lily's eyes widened slightly. She pointed back toward the stable. Yeah. He's in there. You want to see him? She nodded, already unbuckling her seatbelt. Travis helped her down and they walked together toward the collapsed structure, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the yard. In the distance, the mountains had gone purple with evening. Midnight hadn't moved, still stood in that far corner, still watching. But when Lily appeared beside Travis, something changed in the horse's posture. The rigid tension eased slightly. The ears, which had been pinned flat, rotated forward. Lily took one step toward the stable opening. Travis caught her arm gently. "That's close enough, sweetheart. We don't know him yet." But Lily pulled free, not in defiance but with a strange certainty. She walked slowly toward the opening, her small frame casting almost no shadow in the fading light. Travis's heart hammered in his chest, every instinct screaming to grab her back. But something made him wait. The girl stopped 3 feet from the threshold. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, but she raised one hand and held it out palm up in a gesture that looked almost like an offering. For a long moment nothing happened. The wind died completely. Even the birds had gone quiet. Travis could hear his own pulse in his ears, could feel sweat sliding down his spine despite the cooling evening. Then Midnight took one step forward. Then another. His hooves made soft sounds on the packed dirt floor of the stable. He lowered his massive head, bringing it level with Lily's outstretched hand, and Travis saw his daughter go absolutely still. The horse's breath stirred her hair. His dark muzzle moved closer, closer, until it touched her palm with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a wild creature. And Lily smiled. It was the first smile Travis had seen on her face in 3 weeks. Small and fragile as the first crack in winter ice, but real. She kept her hand steady while the horse breathed against her skin. His eyes half closed as if in some private communication Travis couldn't hear. When Midnight finally pulled back and returned to his corner, Lily turned to her father. Her lips moved, shaping a single word without sound. "Stay." Travis felt something break open in his chest. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and held out his hand. Lily came back to him, and together they stood watching the horse in the dying light. The Wyoming sky turned the color of bruised plums. Stars began appearing one by one, more than Travis had seen in years, undimmed by city lights. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of sage and dust and something else, something older that had no name. Travis looked at the collapsed stable, the rusted equipment, the bunkhouse that would be freezing come winter. He thought about the $16,000 he didn't have, the bank that would eventually come calling, the massive amount of work it would take just to make this place barely livable. Then he looked at his daughter, still staring at the horse with something like hope flickering in her eyes. They had nowhere else to go, nothing else waiting. And somehow, against all logic, this wild horse in this broken place had reached something in Lily that Travis couldn't touch. He pulled the keys from his pocket, the brass warm against his palm. The decision made itself. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll stay, at least for a while." In the stable, as if he understood, Midnight stamped once. The sound echoed across the empty land like a drum beat, like a promise, like the beginning of something neither Travis nor his daughter could yet imagine. The first stars were out now, cold and bright and innumerable. Travis gathered their few belongings from the truck and carried them toward the bunkhouse while Lily followed close behind. Tomorrow would bring 1,000 problems he had no idea how to solve. But tonight they had shelter. They had each other. And somewhere in the darkness, a wild horse stood guard over secrets buried deep in the Wyoming earth, waiting for the right moment to reveal what had been hidden for far too long. The first night at Broken Pine Ranch, Travis didn't sleep. He lay on the bare mattress in the bunkhouse, springs digging into his back, listening to sounds he'd forgotten existed. The wind played different notes through gaps in the walls, high whistles and low moans that never quite settled into silence. Something small scurried across the roof, claws scratching on tin. In the distance, coyotes sent up their yipping chorus, and closer, from the direction of the collapsed stable, he could hear Midnight shifting his weight, hooves scuffing against packed earth. Lily had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the drive and the emotion of the day. Travis had given her the only pillow and covered her with both their jackets. She lay curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, looking smaller and more vulnerable than seemed possible. Every few minutes he would glance over to make sure she was still breathing, still there, still his. When dawn finally broke, it came fast and unforgiving. Light spilled through the single window in shades of copper and rose, painting the dust motes gold. Travis sat up, every vertebra in his spine grinding in protest. His back always hurt worse in the mornings, a souvenir from the bull that had ended his rodeo career. The doctors had told him he'd need surgery eventually, fusion of the lower vertebrae, 6 months recovery, $60,000 he'd never see in his lifetime. Until then, he lived on ibuprofen and stubbornness. He pulled on his boots, wincing as he stood, and stepped outside into air so cold it burned his lungs. Frost clung to everything, turning the sagebrush silver and making the broken equipment glitter like treasure. His breath came out in clouds as he walked across the yard toward the stable, drawn by a need to see the horse in daylight, to confirm the events of yesterday hadn't been some fever dream born of desperation. Midnight was awake, standing in the same corner where he'd been the evening before. In the morning light Travis could see details he'd missed. The horse's coat wasn't pure black but held undertones of deep brown, like coffee poured over dark earth. Scars marked his flanks, pale lines where hair had grown back wrong. His hooves needed trimming, overgrown and chipped at the edges. But despite the neglect, despite the wildness, there was something noble in the way he held himself, head high, eyes clear and assessing. Travis stopped at the stable entrance, keeping his distance. "Morning," he said, feeling foolish for talking to an animal that couldn't answer. "Guess we're stuck with each other for a while." The horse flicked one ear toward the sound but didn't move. Travis noticed a metal trough in the corner, bone dry, and another outside near the fallen water barrel. No source of water anywhere visible. The horse must have been getting by on whatever he could find, probably making trips to the dry creek bed looking for seeps and puddles. "We need to get you some water," Travis said, "and food, though I don't know where that's going to come from." As if in answer, his own stomach growled. Their supplies consisted of half a bag of gas station jerky, 2 bottles of water, and a sleeve of crackers. Not exactly a sustainable meal plan. Travis would need to drive back to Clearwater Basin, find the feed store, figure out what it would cost to keep a horse alive out here. Money he didn't have for an animal he didn't know how to handle. He heard the bunkhouse door creak and turned to see Lily emerge, wrapped in both jackets, hair sticking up in all directions. She walked straight toward him without hesitation, and together they stood looking at the horse. "We're going to need supplies," Travis said. "Food for us, feed for him. Water. I need to figure out what this place has for a well, if there's any way to get it working again." Lily nodded, then pointed at midnight and made a gesture Travis didn't understand at first. She repeated it more emphatically. It looked like she was tracing something in the air, a pattern or shape. "You want to draw him?" She nodded vigorously. "Okay, we'll get you paper and pencils too." Travis put his hand on her shoulder. "But first, let's see what we're really dealing with here." They spent the next hour exploring the property in the growing light. Behind the bunkhouse they found the well house, a small wooden structure with a door that had swollen shut from moisture and time. Travis had to throw his shoulder against it 3 times before it finally gave way with a crack that made Lily jump. Inside, the well pump sat on a concrete pad, covered in rust and bird droppings. The mechanism looked ancient, probably installed 50 years ago and barely maintained since. Travis traced the pipe leading down into darkness, then followed the outflow line that should have led to the trough and the bunkhouse. Multiple breaks were visible where the pipe had frozen and burst, leaving gaps that would make the whole system useless even if the pump worked. "This is going to take serious money to fix," Travis said, more to himself than Lily. "New pipes, new pump, maybe someone who actually knows what they're doing." They continued their survey. The fence line was worse than he'd thought, sagging or broken in a dozen places. Any sensible rancher would have replaced it years ago, but Travis's uncle apparently hadn't been worried about livestock wandering off. Of course, with just one horse who seemed to have no interest in leaving, Maybe fence repair hadn't been a priority. Past the stable they found remnants of what might have been a garden once. Now just a rectangle of different weeds than everywhere else. An old hand pump stood in the center, handle frozen with rust. Travis tried to work it, throwing his weight against the resistance, and after a dozen attempts was rewarded with a thin trickle of brown water that smelled like minerals and thyme. "At least there's groundwater," he said, catching his breath. "If we can get that pump working, it's something." Lily had wandered away from him, following a path worn into the hardpan that led toward the back of the property. Travis hurried after her, nervous about her getting too far from sight. The path wound through a stand of twisted juniper, then emerged onto a slight rise that looked out over a shallow canyon. Travis stopped beside his daughter, breath catching for a different reason now. The canyon stretched maybe half a mile across, its walls striped in layers of red and white stone. At the bottom ran what should have been a creek bed, dry now except for isolated pools that glinted in the morning sun. But what caught his attention was the vegetation. Down in that canyon, protected from the worst of the wind and sun, grew trees he hadn't seen anywhere else on the property. Cottonwoods with leaves still green, willows clustered near the water pools, even what looked like wild plum bushes heavy with late summer fruit. Well, Travis breathed. That's something. They stood there for a while just looking. The canyon felt separate from the harsh landscape around it, a pocket of survival hidden from casual view. Birds moved through the trees below, their calls echoing off stone walls. A deer track was visible in the sandy bottom, and what might have been antelope prints. "Your uncle must have known about this," Travis said. "Must have used it somehow." Lily tugged his sleeve and pointed. Travis followed her gesture and saw, barely visible among the junipers on their side of the canyon, a narrow trail switchbacking down the rock face. It looked treacherous, more suited to mountain goats than people, but it had definitely been traveled. The edges were worn smooth, stones displaced by repeated passage. "We'll come back," Travis promised. "Right now we need to get to town before the stores close." The drive to Clearwater Basin felt longer in daylight, every bump and rut in the road more pronounced. Travis's truck bounced through potholes that could swallow a tire, and twice he had to slow to a crawl to navigate washouts where spring runoff had carved channels across the track. He made mental notes of everything that needed repair, and the list grew so long he finally stopped counting. The feed store sat on the edge of town, a weathered building with a loading dock and a hand-painted sign that read Kowalski Feed and Supply. Travis pulled into the gravel lot beside two other trucks, both newer than his by at least a decade. Through the window he could see shelves stacked with bags of grain and supplement, walls hung with tack and tools. Inside, the smell hit him first. Sweet dusty grain mixed with leather oil and something sharper, maybe fertilizer or pesticide. The store was narrow but deep, with aisles barely wide enough for a cart. At the back counter stood a woman probably in her late 50s, gray hair pulled into a practical braid, wearing jeans and a canvas work shirt. She was tallying something in a ledger, reading glasses perched on her nose, and didn't look up until Travis and Lily were halfway down the main aisle. "Help you?" Her voice was neutral, not unfriendly but not warm either. The tone of someone who'd learned to be careful about extending credit. Travis cleared his throat. "I need some horse feed, and whatever you'd recommend for getting an old well pump working again." The woman finally looked up, studying him over her glasses. "You new around here?" "Just inherited my uncle's place. Broken Pine Ranch." Her expression changed immediately, something softening around her eyes. "Ray Brennan's place." She set down her pen and came around the counter. "You must be Travis. I'm Beth Kowalski. I was sorry to hear about Ray. He was a good man." Travis wasn't sure how to respond to that. He barely remembered his uncle, had no idea if he'd been good or terrible or somewhere in between. "Did you know him well?" "Well as anyone did, I suppose. He kept to himself mostly, but he was fair in his dealings. Always paid his bills on time, never asked for something he couldn't afford." Beth's gaze shifted to Lily, who was examining a display of horse treats near the door. "That your daughter?" "Yeah." "Lily. She looks like Ray around the eyes. Same way of watching things." Beth moved toward the feed section, gesturing for Travis to follow. "How's Midnight doing?" The question surprised him. You know about the horse? Everyone knows about Midnight. Ray got him maybe 15 years ago, pulled him out of a bad situation. Some developer had rounded up a bunch of wild Mustangs, planning to ship them south. Ray bought the whole lot and turned most of them loose up in the Bighorns, but he kept that black stallion. Said there was something special about him. Travis thought about the way Midnight had looked at him, that unsettling intelligence. Yeah, he said slowly. There's definitely something about him. Beth pulled down a bag of senior horse feed, setting it on the counter with a solid thump. This is what Ray used. It's easier on older horses' teeth. Got good nutrition. You'll want about 40 pounds a week, maybe a bit more if he's underweight. Travis looked at the price tag and felt his stomach drop. At that rate, feeding one horse would cost more than feeding him and Lily combined. How much did my uncle owe you? When he died, I mean. Beth walked back to her ledger and flipped through pages. Not a cent. He settled his account the week before he passed. Like he knew something was coming. She looked up at Travis. But I'm guessing you're in a different situation. There was no point in lying. I've got maybe $300 to my name. I owe back taxes on the property. My truck's borrowed and my daughter needs things I can't afford. So no, I can't pay for this feed today, and I don't know when I'll be able to. The silence that followed felt heavy. Travis waited for Beth to tell him to leave, to stop wasting her time. Instead, she pulled out a different ledger, one with a blue cover instead of the red she'd been using. Ray helped me out once, she said, not looking at Travis. Long time ago, when my husband died and left me with this place and a pile of debt. Ray bought 6 months of feed up front, kept me from going under until I could get my feet back under me. She wrote something in the blue ledger. I never got to pay him back. Figure I can extend the same courtesy to his nephew. Travis felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. I will pay you back. Soon as I can figure out how to make that place work. I know you will. Beth closed the ledger. Now, about that well pump. You'll need parts one don't stock. But Frank Dawson used to do all Ray's repair work. He's retired now, lives in that trailer park south of town. Might be willing to take a look if you ask nice. She loaded the feed into the truck bed while Travis gathered other essentials. A bale of hay, vitamin supplements, hoof picks, a curry brush. Beth added things he hadn't thought of, a first aid kit for horses, electrolyte powder for the water, a salt block. When Lily appeared at the counter with a small sketch pad and a box of colored pencils, Beth rang them up without comment. You need food for yourself too, she said, eyeing Travis's thin frame. General store across the street will give you basic supplies. Tell Martha I sent you. Why are you helping us? The question came out before Travis could stop it. Beth met his eyes steadily. Because Ray would have done the same. And because that little girl deserves a chance, same as anyone. They left with the truck bed full and Travis's pride in tatters. He hated charity, hated needing help, but he wasn't stupid enough to refuse when Lily's well-being was at stake. At the general store, Martha, a woman who could have been Beth's sister, loaded them up with beans and rice, flour and sugar, coffee and powdered milk. She also added fresh eggs, bacon, and a loaf of bread that was still warm. Beth called ahead, Martha said when Travis tried to refuse the bread. Said you needed a proper meal in you. By the time they headed back to the ranch, the sun was past its peak and Travis's head was spinning with the kindness of strangers. He didn't know how to process it, didn't know what it meant that his uncle had apparently been the kind of man people remembered fondly enough to help his relatives a decade and a half after he'd done them a good turn. At the trailer park south of town, they found Frank Dawson sitting on a folding chair outside a single-wide trailer, working on a chainsaw with patient concentration. He was old, probably pushing 70, with skin weathered dark and hands that shook slightly as they manipulated the small parts. Mr. Dawson? Travis approached slowly, Lily half hidden behind him. Beth Kowalski said you might be able to help with a well pump. Frank looked up, squinting against the sun. Ray's nephew? Yes, sir. The old man set down his tools and stood with the careful movements of someone whose joints didn't cooperate like they used to. Heard you took the place. That's good. Ray would have wanted family there. I don't know anything about him, Travis admitted. Barely met him twice when I was a kid. Frank nodded slowly, like this was what he'd expected. Ray was a private man, didn't talk much about his past, didn't explain his choices. But he was solid, you understand? When he said something, you could build on it. Beth mentioned you used to do repairs out there. Something crossed Frank's face, an expression Travis couldn't quite read. Guilt maybe, or regret. I did, yeah. Until about 3 years ago. Then I stopped going out there. Why? Frank looked away, toward the mountains visible in the distance. That's complicated. But I owe Ray better than I gave him at the end. He turned back to Travis. I'll come look at your pump. Tomorrow morning work for you? That would be great. Travis gave him directions, though Frank said he remembered the way well enough. One more thing, Frank said as they were leaving. Be careful out there. Ray was involved in some things, had some disagreements with people who don't forget easy. You start digging into his business, you might turn up more than you want to find. What kind of things? Frank shook his head. Just be careful. And keep an eye on that horse. Ray always said Midnight knew more than any animal should. The drive back to Broken Pine felt different now, weighted with information Travis didn't know how to organize. His uncle had been respected, had helped people, but had also been involved in unnamed troubles. He'd saved a wild horse and kept it for 15 years. He'd lived alone on failing land and somehow earned the loyalty of people who still remembered him years after he stopped coming to town. When they pulled through the broken gate and parked near the bunkhouse, Midnight was standing outside the stable, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. He raised his head as the truck approached, ears forward, and Travis could have sworn the horse was waiting for them specifically. They unloaded the supplies, Travis carrying the feed while Lily managed the lighter items. He poured grain into a battered metal pan he'd found in the stable, adding water from one of their bottles to soften it. The horse watched from a distance, not approaching until Travis and Lily had backed away to the bunkhouse steps. Then Midnight came forward, moving with a fluid grace that belied his age and the rough conditions. He lowered his head to the pan and ate slowly, methodically, as if each mouthful required consideration. Lily sat on the steps with her new sketchpad already drawing, her hand moving in quick certain strokes. Travis sat beside her, exhausted despite having done relatively little physical work. His back throbbed, his head ached from tension, and the weight of everything they needed to accomplish pressed down like a physical force. But watching his daughter draw, seeing the concentration on her face and the way her fear had eased since they'd arrived, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the memory of what hope used to feel like, and the faint possibility that he might feel it again. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of fire, Travis thought about Frank's warning, about Ray's unnamed troubles and the horse that knew too much, about the canyon with its hidden water and the property that had been left to him for reasons he didn't understand. Tomorrow Frank would come and maybe they could get water flowing again. Tomorrow they'd start figuring out what repairs could be made with no money and limited skill. Tomorrow the future would press in again with all its demands and impossibilities. But tonight they had shelter and food. They had a wild horse eating grain in their yard. They had a community that had shown unexpected kindness. And they had each other, which was more than Travis had dared count on for a long time. Inside the stable, Midnight finished his meal and returned to his corner. In the gathering darkness, Travis could just make out the white blaze on the horse's face, a mark of light in the shadows. The animal stood perfectly still, watching the night come on, and Travis wondered what he was waiting for, what he knew that no one else did. The first stars appeared overhead, cold and distant and beautiful. Somewhere in the darkness a coyote called, and another answered. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and dust and the promise of frost. Travis gathered Lily inside where he lit a fire in the potbelly stove, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. They ate bread and bacon, drank powdered milk, and didn't speak because Lily couldn't and Travis didn't know what to say. But in the silence there was companionship, and in the small warm space they'd carved from the enormous cold night, there was something that felt almost like home. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep and Travis lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the fire and the distant sound of hoofbeats as midnight moved through the darkness. He thought about the choice he'd made. To stay here, to accept this broken inheritance, to try to build something from ruins and desperation. It was probably foolish, probably impossible. But lying there in the dark with his daughter breathing softly across the room and a wild horse standing guard outside, Travis realized he'd already committed, not just to the land or the taxes or the endless repairs, but to something deeper, to the possibility that his uncle had left him more than property, that there was a reason Midnight had waited all these years, that somewhere in this harsh, beautiful country there was a secret worth discovering, and maybe, if he was lucky, a future worth fighting for. The fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, and Travis finally slept, dreamless and deep, while outside in the Wyoming night a black horse with a lightning blaze stood sentinel over mysteries buried in stone and earth, waiting for the moment when broken ground would finally reveal what it had held silent for so long. Part 3. The Catalyst Connection morning came with frost thick enough to crunch underfoot and breath that hung visible in the air like smoke. Travis woke to Lily tugging on his sleeve, her eyes wide and urgent. He sat up too fast, back protesting, mind immediately jumping to disaster. "What's wrong?" She pointed toward the window, where pale light was just beginning to filter through. Travis pulled on his boots and jacket and followed her outside, feet crunching through frozen grass. The sun wasn't quite up yet, the world caught in that strange half-light that made everything look faded and unreal. Lily led him toward the stable, walking quickly despite the cold. Travis's heart rate picked up. Had something happened to Midnight? Was the horse hurt or gone? But as they rounded the corner of the collapsed structure, he stopped short. Midnight stood outside in the open, something he hadn't done since they'd arrived. But more striking was what surrounded him. The horse was encircled by frost patterns unlike anything Travis had seen before. The frozen dew on the ground formed intricate spirals and geometric shapes, as if someone had carefully drawn them with white paint. They radiated outward from where the horse stood, covering an area maybe 20 feet across. "What the hell?" Travis breathed. Lily walked forward without hesitation, approaching the patterns with her hands outstretched. She knelt at the edge of one spiral, tracing it with her finger, not disturbing the delicate frost. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she looked up at her father with a question in her eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe it's just how the frost formed, some quirk of the ground temperature or something." But even as he said it, Travis knew it wasn't true. The patterns were too deliberate, too complex. And they were centered precisely on the spot where Midnight had been standing. The horse himself seemed unconcerned, calmly watching Lily with that same intense intelligence Travis had noticed before. Lily stood and moved closer to Midnight, no fear in her posture. She reached out slowly and the horse lowered his head, allowing her small hand to rest against his nose. They stood like that for a long moment, girl and horse breathing clouds of vapor into the freezing air while the sun finally crested the horizon and began to melt the frost patterns into memory. Travis wanted to pull his daughter back, to protect her from an animal that was essentially wild, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. But something stopped him. The absolute calm in Midnight's posture, the trust in Lily's face, the sense that what was happening here was important in ways he couldn't yet understand. The frost melted quickly once the sun hit it, the patterns dissolving into dark patches on the hardpan. Within minutes, there was no evidence they'd ever existed, except for Lily's drawings in her sketchpad where she'd captured their spiraling geometry in careful pencil strokes. A truck engine sounded from the direction of the main gate. Frank Dawson arriving as promised. Travis called Lily back and together they walked to meet the old man, leaving Midnight standing in the yard. Frank drove an ancient Chevy pickup that looked held together by rust and prayer. He climbed out slowly, carrying a toolbox that had seen better decades. His eyes went immediately to the stable, then to where Midnight stood watching, then back to Travis. "Horse looks good," Frank said. "Better than I expected. Given Ray's been gone 6 weeks. He seems to know how to take care of himself. They do when they're smart enough." Frank hefted his toolbox. "Show me this pump you need looked at." Travis led him to the well house while Lily stayed in the yard with her sketchpad. sketching midnight from different angles. Inside the small structure, Frank knelt with difficulty beside the old pump, running his hands over it with the familiarity of someone who'd serviced it many times before. "This is older than I am," he said, surprised it worked as long as it did. He pulled out tools and began disassembling the mechanism, muttering to himself as he worked. Travis watched, trying to learn, but the complexity of seals and valves and pressure chambers was beyond his limited mechanical knowledge. They worked in silence for a while, Frank's shaking hands somehow still capable of precise movements despite their tremor. Travis noticed scars on the old man's forearms, the kind that came from years of manual labor and occasional accidents. Finally Frank sat back on his heels. "Seals blown, bearings are shot, impellers cracked. I can patch it enough to get you water, but it won't last more than a few months. You'll need a new pump eventually, and that's not cheap." "How much to patch it?" "Parts one can probably scrounge if you don't mind used. Labor, well..." Frank looked at him steadily. "Ray helped me out of a bind once. I figure I owe him a debt, and debts don't die just because a man does. No charge, but you'll owe me a favor someday. I can't keep taking charity. It's not charity, it's commerce. Just delayed commerce." Frank turned back to the pump. "I'll need to go get parts. Be back this afternoon. In the meantime, you should walk your property lines, see what you've actually got here. Ray owned more land than just what you can see from the buildings." "How much more?" 200 acres, give or take. Goes back to that canyon you can see from the rise, includes about half of it. There's good water down there year-round. Ray protected it, wouldn't let anyone else access it even when they offered good money." "Why not?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Like I said yesterday, Ray had principles. Sometimes they made powerful people angry." He stood with effort, knees cracking. "You be careful, Travis. This land has history, and not all of it's good." After Frank left to hunt for parts, Travis gathered Lily, and they set out to explore the property properly. They followed the fence line heading west, finding it in even worse condition than he'd thought. Whole sections were down completely, wire tangled in sagebrush or stretched across the ground. Wooden posts had rotted through at ground level, falling over in storms or simply surrendering to time. But as they walked, Travis began to notice other things. Survey stakes at regular intervals, their paint faded but still visible. Signs of trails worn into the hardpan, though not by cattle or vehicles. And at several points along the fence line, stones stacked in deliberate cairns that seemed to mark something significant. When they reached the rise overlooking the canyon, Travis stopped to catch his breath and take in the view in full daylight. From here he could see the entire depression, maybe 3/4 of a mile long and half a mile across at its widest point. The creek bed meandered through the bottom, holding more water than he'd realized. Several pools looked deep enough to support fish, and the vegetation along the banks was surprisingly lush for this drought-stricken landscape. "Your uncle was sitting on a fortune," Travis muttered. "In this country, water like that is worth more than gold." They took the narrow trail down into the canyon, Travis going first and holding Lily's hand for the steep parts. Halfway down he noticed something carved into the rock face, weathered but still legible. Initials and a date. RB 1982. His uncle had marked his territory 43 years ago, when Travis would have been just a baby. At the bottom the temperature was noticeably cooler, the canyon walls providing shade and trapping moisture. Travis knelt beside one of the pools, cupping water in his hand. It was clear and cold, tasting of minerals but clean. Drinkable. Valuable beyond measure in a region where aquifers were dropping and wells were running dry. They followed the creek downstream, finding more surprises. An old stone structure built into the canyon wall, maybe 10 feet square with a timber roof that had partially collapsed. Inside, protected from weather, were more stacked stones arranged in patterns Travis couldn't interpret. Not random, definitely deliberate, but their purpose was unclear. Lily tugged his sleeve and pointed to marks on the stone floor. Scratches or gouges, worn smooth by time but still visible. For parallel lines, repeating. Travis ran his hand over them, trying to understand. They were too regular to be natural erosion, too deliberate to be accidental damage. Horseshoes, he realized suddenly. These marks were made by horseshoes, by an animal standing here repeatedly over a long period of time. But why would Ray bring a horse down into the canyon and stable it in this particular spot? He looked around more carefully, examining the stone walls. They were layered sedimentary rock, bands of red and white and gray. In one section the layers seemed disrupted, as if the stone had fractured and shifted at some point in the distant past. A crack ran from floor to ceiling, wide enough to slip a hand into, dark inside where the light couldn't reach. Travis pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the crack. The beam revealed a space beyond, larger than expected. Not quite a cave, but more than a simple fissure. He could see something in there, shapes that didn't look like natural stone formations. "We need to come back with real lights," he said to Lily. "And maybe rope. There's something in there." They climbed back out of the canyon as the sun approached noon, Travis's back screaming in protest at the steep ascent. At the top they found Midnight waiting, as if the horse had known exactly where they'd gone and when they'd return. Lily went to him immediately, pressing her forehead against his neck while the horse stood perfectly still. Travis watched them. This impossible connection between his traumatized daughter and a wild animal that should have wanted nothing to do with humans. Lily's lips were moving, he realized. She was speaking to the horse, words too quiet for Travis to hear. Her voice finally finding sound even if it wouldn't yet reach her father. His chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. Relief, jealousy, hope, fear, all mixed together. He wanted to be the one Lily talked to, the one she trusted with her words. But if speaking to a horse helped her find her voice again, he'd take it. Whatever worked, whatever helped her heal. Frank returned in the early afternoon with a box of parts scavenged from who knew where. He worked for 2 hours in the well house, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite their tremor. Travis tried to help but mostly stayed out of the way, handing over tools when asked and learning what he could just buy. Watching. Finally Frank hit a switch and the pump groaned to life, making sounds that suggested imminent death but somehow continuing to run. Water began to flow through the patched pipes, gurgling and spitting air at first, then running steadier. Frank adjusted valves and checked pressure while Travis waited with held breath. "That should do it," Frank said finally. "It's not pretty and it won't last forever, but you've got water now." He wiped his hands on a rag, leaving streaks of grease and rust. The trough outside should fill automatically once the line clears. "May take a bit, there's a lot of air in the system." Travis didn't know how to express his gratitude. "This is more than I can repay." Frank gathered his tools slowly. "You want to repay me? Then do what Ray would have done. Stand up for this land. Don't let the bastards take it from you." "What bastards?" Frank's jaw worked as if he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "Ray was fighting a water rights battle when he died. Developer out of Denver, woman named Victoria Castellano. She's been buying up properties all through this basin. Controls most of the surface rights now, trying to consolidate it all under her company. She made Ray offers, good money, but he wouldn't sell. Said some things shouldn't be for sale. What did she want the land for?" Frank shrugged. "Development, probably. Ranchettes for rich folks from the city, or maybe just to control the water. That canyon on your property, it feeds into a larger system. Control that water and you control everything downstream." Ray understood that. Died before she could pressure him into selling or lawyer him into submission. Travis felt cold despite the afternoon heat. "And now I own it. Now you own it. And she'll come for you same as she came for Ray." Frank climbed into his truck, moving like every joint hurt. "You seem like a decent man, Travis. Got a good kid there. Don't let anyone tell you this land isn't worth fighting for." After Frank left, Travis stood in the yard listening to water run through pipes for the first time in years. The trough began to fill, slowly at first then faster as the air cleared from the lines. Midnight approached cautiously, nostrils flaring at the sound, then lowered his head to drink. The sight of the black horse taking deep pulls of fresh water, droplets falling from his muzzle to darken the dusty ground, hit Travis with unexpected emotion. This was what land was supposed to provide. Water, shelter, sustenance. Basic things that became miracles when you'd been living without them. He thought about Victoria Castellano, this woman he'd never met who apparently wanted what he'd just inherited. Thought about his uncle fighting to protect this place, dying before the battle was finished. Travis had never thought of himself as a fighter. He'd been a rodeo rider once, but that was different. That was just him against an animal and the clock, no larger principles at stake. What Frank was describing sounded like war, the kind fought in courtrooms and county offices, with weapons Travis didn't know how to use. But watching Lily sit beside the trough while Midnight drank, seeing something like peace on his daughter's face, Travis felt resolve harden in him. Maybe he didn't know how to fight this kind of battle. Maybe he'd lose. But he wasn't going to just hand over what his uncle had protected for 40 years without at least trying to understand why it mattered. That evening they ate better than they had in weeks. Beans and bacon cooked on the potbelly stove, bread toasted crispy, coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of regret. Lily drew in her sketchpad while Travis studied the survey map Frank had left, trying to understand the property boundaries and what they meant. The canyon was marked clearly, along with the creek bed and several other features he hadn't explored yet. Notes in the margins indicated water rights dating back to the 1880s, grandfathered in under territorial law. Travis didn't understand all the legal language, but the implications seemed clear. The water in that canyon legally belonged to this property, and had for over a century. Why would Ray never sell? Travis wondered aloud. That kind of water in this country, he could have been a rich man. Lily stopped drawing and looked at him, then began writing in the margin of her sketchpad. She held up the sketchpad so he could read what she'd written in careful block letters. Some things are more important than money. Travis stared at the words, written in his daughter's hand, and felt something shift inside him. Out of the mouths of babes, as his own mother used to say. Lily had distilled in 7 words what Frank had been trying to explain, what his uncle had apparently understood, what Travis was only beginning to grasp. "You're right," he said softly. "You're absolutely right." As darkness fell, Travis stepped outside for air. The temperature had dropped dramatically, as it always did in the high desert, and his breath fogged in the cold. Stars were emerging in impossible numbers, the Milky Way a bright smear across the black sky. He'd forgotten what real darkness looked like, what the universe showed when artificial light wasn't drowning it out. Midnight stood near the water trough, a dark shape against darker shadows. As Travis watched, the horse turned and walked deliberately toward the canyon rise, then stopped and looked back. The white blaze on his face caught starlight, a beacon in the night. Travis followed, drawn by curiosity and something deeper he couldn't name. The horse waited until Travis was close, then continued walking, setting a pace that was easy to match. They crossed the yard, passed through the broken fence line, and climbed the rise together in silence punctuated only by the sound of hooves on stone and boots on hardpan. At the top, Midnight stopped at the edge overlooking the canyon. The depression below was invisible in darkness, just a deeper black against the black landscape. But Travis could hear water moving, a sound he was learning to recognize, precious and rare in this country. The horse lowered his head and pawed at the ground once, twice, 3 times. A deliberate action, not random movement. Travis knelt where the hoof had struck and felt the earth. Different texture here, softer somehow. He pulled out his phone for light and saw disturbed soil, darker than the surrounding ground. Something buried, recently enough that the earth hadn't fully settled. Travis brushed away loose dirt with his hands, feeling foolish but unable to stop. 6 inches down, his fingers hit something solid. Smooth, metal. He dug more carefully now, working the object free. It was a tin box, maybe 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, sealed with a latched lid. The metal was weathered but intact, protected by the soil from the worst of the elements. Travis's heart hammered as he brushed off the remaining dirt and carried the box into better light. Midnight watched him work, perfectly still, as if this was exactly what he'd intended, as if he'd been waiting for someone to find what he'd been guarding. Back at the bunkhouse, Travis set the box on the table while Lily pressed close, eyes wide with excitement. The latch was stiff but not rusted shut. With effort it gave way and the lid opened with a faint squeal of protesting metal. Inside, Wrapped in oilcloth was a leather journal. Travis lifted it out carefully, aware he was handling something important, possibly fragile. The cover was worn smooth by handling, the leather soft and supple despite years of age. No title, no name, just blank leather and the weight of words inside. He opened to the first page and recognized his uncle's handwriting immediately. The same script from the survey map, precise and economical. The date at the top of the page was March 15, 1982. The first entry Travis had found marked the beginning of something. Bought the canyon property today. 200 acres, including half the watershed. Paid more than I should have, but it's worth it. The water here is clean and year-round, fed by springs that don't depend on snowmelt. In 10 years, this whole basin will be desperate for water. In 20 years, people will kill for it. I won't let that happen. This water belongs to the land and the land belongs to itself. My job is just to protect it until someone else understands. Travis read the words twice, 3 times, feeling the weight of them. His uncle had known 43 years ago what was coming, had seen the future clearly enough to make decisions that would echo across decades. He flipped through pages, scanning entries. Ray's journal covered years of observation and planning. Notes about water levels, precipitation patterns, wildlife that depended on the canyon springs. Descriptions of neighboring properties being sold, consolidated, changed from family ranches into corporate holdings. Names appearing repeatedly. Castellano Development Corporation. Victoria Castellano herself, mentioned first in 1997. Made an offer today. $250,000 for the water rights alone, keep the land. Told her no. Money can't buy what it can't replace. She didn't take it well. Threatened legal action. Said she'd find a way to claim the water regardless. Let her try. The rights are ironclad, go back to territorial days. She can't lawyer her way around history. But the journal made clear that Victoria had tried. Over the next decade, entries documented her attempts to acquire the property through various means. Offers that climbed to $500,000, then $1 million. Pressure on the county to reinterpret water laws. Attempts to prove the rights were invalid or had been forfeited. Each time Ray had fought back, using the law itself as his weapon, defending what he believed couldn't be compromised. The final entry was dated 5 weeks before Ray's death. Getting old now. Pneumonia won't kill me, but it's warning me time is short. Need to make arrangements. The water has to be protected after I'm gone. Travis is the only family left. Don't know him well, but he's got a daughter, and that means he understands legacy whether he knows it or not. The horse will help. Midnight knows where everything is buried. He'll lead Travis to the truth if Travis is smart enough to follow. Some inheritances can't be explained in legal documents. They have to be discovered. That's the only way they mean anything. Travis set the journal down with shaking hands. His uncle had planned this. All of it. The inheritance, the horse, the journey of discovery. Ray had known Travis would need to find these things himself, would need to understand their value through his own effort rather than having it handed to him on paper. He looked at Lily, who was reading over his shoulder, her lips moving silently as she worked through the handwriting. She looked up at him with understanding in her eyes, mature beyond her years in that moment. Outside, midnight stamped once, the sound carrying clearly through the thin walls. Travis went to the window and saw the horse standing in the yard, head raised toward the canyon, ears pricked forward, waiting for something, listening for something, guarding something that Travis was only beginning to comprehend. The next morning brought clouds, low and gray, promising rain that might or might not come. Travis woke with the journal still on the table, having read it 3 more times before exhaustion finally dragged him under. Each reading revealed new details, new connections. His uncle had been methodical in his documentation, creating a record that was part evidence, part instruction manual, part confession. After breakfast, Travis made a decision. They needed to explore that crack in the canyon wall, needed to see what his uncle had been protecting down there. He gathered what supplies they had. Flashlights, rope, water bottles, first aid kit. Basic gear, but hopefully sufficient. Lily dressed in layers against the cold and followed him without question. Her sketchpad tucked into a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. They walked to the canyon rim where midnight was already waiting, as if the horse had known their plans before they'd made them. The descent was easier the second time, Travis's body learning the trail's rhythm. At the bottom they followed the creek bed to the stone structure built into the canyon wall. In daylight Travis could see more details he'd missed before. The stones had been carefully fitted, work that required skill and patience. The timber roof, though partially collapsed, showed evidence of proper joinery. This wasn't some thrown-together shelter. It had been built to last. Inside, Travis approached the crack in the rock wall with his flashlight. The beam penetrated deeper than his phone light had, revealing that the space beyond was more extensive than he'd realized. Not quite a cave, but a natural chamber maybe 15 feet across, the crack widening into a void carved by water or seismic activity countless years ago. "Stay here," he told Lily. "Let me check if it's safe." He eased through the crack sideways, feeling stone press against his chest and back. His damaged spine protested, but the opening was just wide enough. On the other side he straightened carefully, playing the flashlight beam around the chamber. The space took his breath away. The walls were layered stone in bands of color, red and white and pale gold. Water had carved patterns into the rock, swirls and curves that looked almost deliberate. But what stopped Travis cold were the objects arranged against the far wall. Wooden crates, 5 of them, stacked carefully on flat stones to keep them off the damp floor. Travis approached slowly, his light revealing stenciled text on the wood. "Property of U.S. Geological Survey, dated 1891. Below that, handwritten in faded ink, Silver Creek Mining District. His hands trembled as he worked the lid off the top crate. Inside, nested in straw that crumbled at his touch, were core samples. Cylinders of rock maybe 2 inches across and a foot long, each labeled with coordinates and dates. Travis lifted one carefully, examining it in his flashlight beam. The stone was streaked with metallic veins that caught the light. Even with his limited knowledge, Travis recognized what he was seeing. Silver ore. High grade, from the look of it, the metal content visible to the naked eye. The other crates held similar samples, along with survey maps printed on heavy paper, geological reports typed on ancient typewriters, and claim forms filled out in careful script. Travis spread them across the floor, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This chamber was apparently part of a mine complex that had operated briefly in the 1890s. The Silver Creek Mining District had been established, claims filed, initial surveys completed. The reports documented promising mineral deposits, high quality or potential for significant extraction. Then, inexplicably, the operation had been abandoned. The final report, dated November 1891, simply stated that the claim holder had decided not to pursue further development. But there was more. Tucked into the bottom of one crate was a modern folder, plastic and recent. Inside were legal documents, copies of claim transfers and property deeds going back over a century. Travis's limited understanding of mining law was stretched to breaking, but the pattern was clear. The original silver claim had never been properly closed. It had been transferred through a series of owners, each passing it on without ever developing it, until finally it had come to Raymond Brennan in 1982. The same year Ray had bought the canyon property. The same year he'd started his journal. This wasn't coincidence. His uncle had known about the silver, had deliberately acquired the land and the dormant mining claim, and then had done nothing with either except protect them. Travis sat back on his heels, trying to process the implications. This chamber, this mineral deposit, represented potential wealth that could solve every financial problem he had, and then some. Mining rights to silver deposits like these, even old claims, could be sold for serious money. Enough to pay taxes, fix the property, cover Lily's medical needs for years. But his uncle had left it untouched. Had protected it like he'd protected the water, as if the value of keeping it buried outweighed any price it might bring to the surface. "Dad?" The sound of Lily's voice, actual spoken words, hit Travis like a physical blow. He scrambled to his feet and squeezed back through the crack to find his daughter standing just inside the stone structure, looking worried. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she was testing whether it still worked. "You were gone a long time. Travis crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her into a hug that made her squeak. "You're talking. Lily, you're talking." She hugged him back, small arms tight around his waist. "The horse?" she whispered. "He told me it was okay, that I could trust my voice again." Travis pulled back to look at her face. "Midnight told you?" She nodded solemnly. "Not with words, but I understood. He said some things need to be spoken out loud, even if they're scary. He said you needed to hear my voice." Travis felt tears burning his eyes and didn't try to stop them. He knelt so they were eye to eye. "I've needed to hear your voice every day since you stopped talking. But I would have waited forever if that's what you needed." "I know," Lily said. "That's why it was okay to start again." They held each other in that ancient stone structure while outside clouds gathered and the first drops of rain began to fall. The sound echoed off canyon walls, the first rain Travis had heard since arriving at Broken Pine. It fell harder, becoming a downpour that drummed on stone and turned the dry creek bed into a rushing stream within minutes. They couldn't leave yet, not safely. The trail would be treacherous in the rain. So they sat together in the shelter while Travis explained what he'd found in the chamber. He used simple language, trying to make sense of it for both of them. "Your great-uncle Ray discovered something valuable here. Silver, metal that's worth a lot of money. But he never mined it, never told anyone. Just kept it secret and protected the land around it." "Why?" Lily asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Travis thought about the journal entries, the notes about water and legacy and things that shouldn't be for sale. Maybe because once you start taking wealth out of the land, you can't stop. Maybe because he knew that mining would destroy the water, and the water was more important. Is it more important? Travis looked at his daughter's serious face, thought about the choice that was forming before him. The silver represented salvation, financial security, an end to their struggles. But mining, it would mean industrial equipment, chemical processing, environmental damage. It would mean destroying the very thing that made this land valuable to the people and animals who needed it. "I think it might be," he said slowly. "Yeah, I think it might be." They waited out the storm in the stone shelter, watching water pour through gaps in the damaged roof, listening to thunder echo off canyon walls. Lily drew in her sketchpad while Travis reread sections of Ray's journal by flashlight, looking for guidance his uncle had left behind. One entry stood out, written about 10 years after Ray had acquired the property. "Castellano offered $2 million today. For the land, the water, everything. Said she knows about the mineral deposits, has her own surveys proving the silver is there. Threatened to go to court, claim the mining rights are separate from the property rights. Might be able to do it too, laws are complicated where old claims are involved. But winning in court and being right aren't the same thing. This land and everything in it belongs together. Pull one thread and the whole fabric tears." Told her no again. Money's not real wealth. Real wealth is clean water, healthy soil, wild things living free. That's what's worth protecting. Travis closed the journal and looked at Lily. "Your great-uncle was either very wise or very crazy. Maybe both. Which do you think?" Travis considered the question seriously. "I think he was wise. I think he understood something most people don't. That some things, once you destroy them, can never be fixed. And that protecting those things is more important than getting rich." The rain eased to a drizzle, then stopped completely. They emerged from the shelter to find the canyon transformed. Water flowed freely down the creek bed. Pools had deepened and connected. Vegetation looked greener than it had an hour before. The whole landscape had come alive with moisture it desperately needed. They climbed back to the rim carefully, the trail muddy and slick. Midnight waited at the top, coat dark with rain, steam rising from his body in the cool air. He came to Lily immediately and she pressed her face against his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me find my voice." The horse blew out through his nostrils, warm breath stirring her hair, and Travis could have sworn he saw understanding in those dark eyes. Whatever bond had formed between his daughter and this animal, it was real and deep and healing in ways Travis couldn't fully comprehend. As they walked back to the bunkhouse, Travis made mental notes of everything that needed to be done. The property had to be secured, the legal claims needed to be understood and protected, Defenses had to be prepared against Victoria Castellano's inevitable moves. But more than that, he needed to understand his uncle's vision, needed to see this land the way Ray had seen it. Not as a resource to be exploited, not as an asset to be liquidated, but as a trust to be guarded, a legacy to be passed on, a responsibility that came with the inheritance just as surely as the deeds and documents. That evening, with Lily asleep and the journal open before him, Travis began making his own notes. He documented what they'd found in the canyon chamber, sketched maps showing the location of the silver deposits, outlined the legal history as best he understood it. He was creating his own record, following in his uncle's footsteps, building on the foundation Ray had laid. Outside, Midnight stood in the yard under clearing skies, his black coat gleaming wet in the moonlight. The horse was watching the canyon, ears forward, as if listening for something only he could hear. Travis joined him, standing in the cold night air, looking out over land that was simultaneously his greatest burden and his greatest gift. He thought about the choice ahead: keep the silver secret and struggle to survive, or exploit it and lose everything that made this place worth having. It should have been an impossible decision. He was broke, desperate, responsible for a daughter who needed more than he could provide. But watching Midnight stand guard over the canyon, remembering Lily's first words in weeks, reading his uncle's passionate defense of principles over profit, Travis realized the choice wasn't impossible at all. Some things were more important than money. Some legacies couldn't be measured in dollars. Some inheritances came with obligations that mattered more than personal survival. He didn't have all the answers yet. Didn't know how he'd pay the taxes or fight Victoria Castellano or keep the property from being seized. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the silver would stay buried, the water would stay protected, and whatever happened next, he would face it knowing he'd chosen to honor what his uncle had built rather than destroy it for temporary comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, standing in the darkness with a wild horse and a sleeping daughter and a legacy he was only beginning to understand, Travis Brennan finally felt like he knew why he'd been brought to this harsh, beautiful place. Not to escape his failures, not to find easy solutions, but to learn that real inheritance isn't what you receive. It's what you choose to protect for those who come after. The week following the rainstorm brought changes that seemed to accelerate with each passing day. Frank Dawson returned twice more, bringing additional parts for the well system and helping Travis understand the basics of maintenance. The old man worked slowly but thoroughly, his trembling hands somehow still capable of precise adjustments. And each visit he shared more stories about Ray. "Your uncle was stubborn as Wyoming bedrock," Frank said one afternoon while tightening a valve connection. "Once he decided something was right, nothing could move him. Made him hard to know sometimes. But you always knew where you stood." "Did he ever talk about family?" Travis asked. "About why he stayed out here alone?" Frank wiped grease from his hands, considering the question. "Once, maybe 10 years back, he told me he'd made choices early in life that closed certain doors. Said he didn't regret the choices, but he regretted the doors. That's all he'd say about it. Then he'd change the subject to water tables or fence repair. The repairs Frank completed made life measurably easier. Water now flowed reliably to the trough and to a spigot Travis could access near the bunkhouse. It was still cold water only, no heating system, but having clean water on demand felt like luxury after days of rationing bottles. Lily used the new sketchpad Beth had included with their supplies to draw elaborate plans for improvements to the property, her voice growing stronger each day as she narrated her ideas. "We could fix up the stable," she suggested one evening over dinner. "Make it nice for Midnight. He deserves a real home." Travis looked at his daughter, seeing her animation and purpose, and felt his resolve strengthen. "That's a good idea. We'll add it to the list." The list was growing impossibly long. Fence repair, roof patching, clearing collapsed sections of the stable, replacing broken windows in the bunkhouse, addressing the dozen other structural problems that revealed themselves daily. Each item required time, materials, and money Travis didn't have. But he'd learned from his uncle's journal that some battles were won through persistence rather than resources. Beth stopped by midweek with another delivery of supplies, waving off Travis's renewed promises to pay her back. "Your credit's good," she said firmly. "Ray taught me that sometimes you invest in people, not transactions. I'm investing in you making this work." She'd brought more than feed and groceries. A box of hand tools, weathered but functional. Several coils of wire and fence staples. A tarp that could temporarily patch the worst holes in the stable roof. When Travis protested that it was too much, Beth fixed him with a look that reminded him of his mother. "You gonna stand there arguing, or you gonna put this stuff to use? Time's wasting and winter's coming. This country doesn't forgive people who aren't ready when the cold hits." Travis and Lily spent the afternoon stringing wire, replacing broken fence posts where they could, at least making the perimeter look more intentional even if it wasn't truly functional. The physical work felt good despite his aching back, gave him something tangible to show for the hours. Lily helped where she could, holding wire taut while he stapled it, handing him tools, chattering about her drawings and plans. Midnight followed their progress from various vantage points around the property, never getting too close but always visible. The horse had a way of positioning himself that suggested watchfulness rather than mere grazing. Several times Travis caught him staring toward the main gate, ears pricked forward, body tense as if anticipating something. On the 5th night after the rainstorm, Travis woke to find Midnight standing directly outside the bunkhouse window. The horse was silhouetted against moonlight, perfectly still except for his ears rotating independently like radar dishes. Travis rose quietly, trying not to wake Lily, and stepped outside into air so cold it hurt to breathe. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. "What do you hear?" The horse didn't acknowledge him, completely focused on something beyond Travis's perception. Then Travis heard it too, faint but growing louder. An engine. A vehicle coming up the road toward the property, moving slowly, no headlights visible. Travis's pulse quickened. Nobody had legitimate business out here after midnight. He watched the gate area, trying to see through darkness and distance. The engine sound grew closer, then stopped. For several minutes there was silence. Then came the metallic sound of the gate being opened, chain rattling against post. Someone was entering the property without permission, without announcing themselves, in the middle of the night. Travis felt adrenaline dump into his system, fight or flight instincts warring with common sense. He had no weapons beyond hand tools, no phone service reliable enough to call for help, no neighbors close enough to hear if he yelled. But he had Midnight. The horse had moved between Travis and the direction of the intruder, standing like a black wall of muscle and determination. His ears were pinned flat now, nostrils flared, and Travis could see tension coiling through his body. "Easy," Travis breathed. "Let's see what they want first." The vehicle crept closer, still running dark. Travis could make out a pickup truck, newer than his borrowed Ford, moving carefully around potholes as if the driver knew the road well. It stopped about 50 yards from the bunkhouse and the engine cut off. A door opened and a figure climbed out, flashlight clicking on. The beam swept across the yard, catching the broken stable, the repaired fence line, the water trough. Then it found Travis standing in front of the bunkhouse with Midnight positioned protectively beside him. The lights stayed on them for a long moment before a voice called out, male and rough. "That's Ray's horse. Frank told me you were keeping the animal. Who are you?" Travis called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want?" The figure approached slowly, flashlight lowered to point at the ground rather than Travis's eyes. As he came into the moonlight, Travis could see a man in his 60s, weathered face and stocky build, wearing ranch clothes and a jacket that had seen better seasons. "Name's Dale Pritchard. I ranch about 12 miles east of here. Ray and I had an understanding about water access during dry years. I've got cattle dying and my well's going dry. Came to see if the creek in your canyon is running." Travis felt some of the tension ease. A neighbor with water problems made more sense than a middle-of-the-night threat. But the timing and approach still felt wrong. "You could have come during the day. Asked properly instead of sneaking in after midnight." Dale stopped about 20 feet away, holding his hands visible and empty. "Could have. But I heard Victoria Castellanos got her eye on this place now that Ray's gone. Heard she's been making inquiries. putting pressure on the county about water allocations. Figured if she knew I was still accessing the canyon, she'd use it against you. Lawyers can make anything look illegal if they twist it right. Travis considered this. His uncle's journal had mentioned neighbors who depended on the water, though no names were specified. And Ray had clearly been willing to share with people he trusted while keeping corporate interests at bay. The creek's running, Travis said. Storm earlier this week filled it up pretty good. But I need to understand what this arrangement was. My uncle didn't leave clear instructions. Dale nodded slowly. Fair enough. Ray let me run a small herd through the canyon during August and September when everything else dries up. Maybe 40 head, never more than that. In return, I helped with repairs, kept an eye on the property when he traveled, ran off anyone who came around asking too many questions. What kind of questions? Surveyors mostly. People wanting to assess mineral rights or water resources. Ray didn't want anyone knowing what was down in that canyon, so I made sure they didn't get close enough to find out. He gestured back toward his truck. I've got documentation if you want to see it. Written agreement Ray and I signed 15 years ago. Travis was torn between caution and the realization that he needed allies, people who understood this land and its value. Come back tomorrow in daylight. Bring your paperwork and we'll talk properly. If everything checks out, we'll figure out how to continue what my uncle started. Dale studied him for a moment, then nodded. Tomorrow then. Appreciate you not running me off tonight. And he gestured toward Midnight, who hadn't relaxed his defensive posture. That horse has good instincts. Ray always said Midnight could spot trouble before it arrived. You'd do well to trust him. After Dale left, Travis stood in the cold with his hand resting on Midnight's neck, feeling the animal's heartbeat gradually slow as the perceived threat departed. The horse had known something was wrong before Travis heard the engine, had positioned himself as protection before any danger was visible. Whatever connection Ray had forged with this animal, it ran deeper than simple training. Back inside, Travis found Lily awake, clutching her sketchpad like a shield. Did you hear that? She whispered. Yeah, sweetheart. Just a neighbor checking on water. Nothing to worry about. But Lily's eyes were sharp with an intelligence beyond her years. Midnight knew something was coming. He told me to stay inside and stay quiet. Travis sat on the edge of her mattress, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. The horse told you? She nodded solemnly. Not with words, but I understood. He was protecting us. Travis didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know where the line was between imagination and something more genuine. But he'd seen enough of the bond between his daughter and the horse to know it shouldn't be dismissed easily. He's a good horse, Travis said finally. Your great-uncle chose well. They lay awake for a while after that, listening to night sounds and the occasional stamp of hooves as Midnight patrolled the yard. Eventually Lily's breathing deepened into sleep, but Travis remained alert, thinking about Dale's visit and Frank's warnings and Victoria Castellano's looming presence. The pattern was becoming clear. People knew about this property, knew it held value beyond what appeared on the surface. His uncle had spent decades keeping those secrets while selectively sharing with people he trusted. Now that responsibility had passed to Travis, whether he was ready for it or not. Over the next few days, Midnight's unusual behavior intensified. The horse began spending hours at the canyon rim, staring down into the depression as if watching for something. He'd paw at specific spots on the ground, always the same locations, always with the same deliberate three-strike pattern. And at night he'd position himself at different points around the property, cycling through what seemed like established patrol routes. Travis followed him one afternoon, curious about the pattern. Midnight led him to 6 distinct locations over the course of 2 hours. At each spot the horse would stop, paw the ground 3 times, and wait until Travis examined the area. The locations seemed random at first, scattered across the property with no obvious connection. But when Travis marked them on the survey map that evening, a pattern emerged. The 6 locations formed a rough hexagon around the central property area, each positioned at what would be strategic vantage points for observing approaches from different directions. His uncle had created a surveillance system using the landscape itself, and Midnight was showing Travis the key observation posts. At each location Travis found subtle signs of regular use. Flattened areas where someone had stood repeatedly. Small cairns of stacked stones marking exact positions. And at 3 of the sites, metal boxes buried shallow enough to find with minimal digging. Inside the boxes were journals. Not his uncle's handwriting, but different people's notes. Neighbors, Travis realized. People Ray had trusted to help watch the property. The journals documented observations going back years. Vehicles that had approached and been turned away. Surveyors who'd tried to access the canyon without permission. Multiple entries about Victoria Castellano's representatives, attempting various methods to gain information or access. The most recent entry was dated 2 weeks before Ray's death. Castellano sent lawyers today with documents claiming prior water rights. Ray met them at the gate with his own lawyers and county records proving her claim was fabricated. She's getting desperate. That makes her dangerous. Need to increase vigilance. Travis photographed the journal pages with his phone, then carefully replaced the boxes where he'd found them. He was beginning to understand the scale of what his uncle had built. Not just a defense of property rights, but a network of observation and documentation designed to protect the land from forces that would exploit it. That night he spread out all his discoveries, the journals and maps and legal documents, trying to piece together the complete picture. Lily sat beside him, drawing her own map based on his notes, her artistic eye-catching connections he'd missed. "These places midnight showed you," she said, tracing her finger along the hexagon pattern. "They're all high ground. You can see everything from there." Travis looked at her drawing and realized she was right. The observation posts didn't just cover the property. They commanded views of all approaching routes. Anyone trying to access the canyon or the main buildings would be visible from at least 2 positions. "Your great-uncle was building a fortress," Travis said. "Not with walls, but with knowledge and sight lines. Because he knew people wanted what he had," Lily replied. "And he knew they'd come eventually." The understanding settled over Travis like a weight. His uncle hadn't just protected this land during his lifetime. He'd prepared it to be protected after he was gone. Had set up systems and recruited allies and trained a horse to guard secrets that couldn't be written down. Ray had known his death would create vulnerability, so he'd built redundancy into every aspect of the defense. And he'd left it all to Travis, who knew nothing about legal battles or property rights or corporate maneuvering. The inheritance was both gift and test, a challenge to prove himself worthy of what he'd been given. Dale Pritchard returned the next day as promised, arriving in daylight with a manila folder of documents. He and Travis sat at the bunkhouse table while Lily sketched midnight outside, and together they reviewed the water-sharing agreement Ray had established. It was simple and clear, handwritten on notebook paper but witnessed and dated, establishing Dale's right to graze limited cattle in the canyon during specific months in return for security assistance and property maintenance. "Your uncle was careful about documentation," Dale explained. "Said you couldn't defend what you couldn't prove. He taught me to keep records of everything, every encounter, every threat, every attempt to undermine the water rights." "Did he tell you about the silver?" Travis asked, watching Dale's reaction. The older man's expression didn't change. "He told me there were mineral deposits. Didn't specify what kind or where exactly. Said knowing too much made a person vulnerable to pressure, legal or otherwise. I figured if he wanted me to know details, he'd tell me. He didn't, so I didn't ask." Travis appreciated the discretion. "Smart policy. I'm going to continue it. The less people know about specifics, the better." They agreed to maintain the existing arrangement with one addition. Dale would increase his security patrols and would alert Travis immediately to any unusual activity. In return, Travis wouldn't restrict Dale's access to the canyon water as long as the usage remained sustainable. After Dale left, Travis felt the network of protection around the property solidify slightly. One ally confirmed, others likely waiting to reveal themselves once they knew Travis was committed to continuing Ray's work. But with allies would come expectations, responsibilities, the need to prove he could be trusted the way his uncle had been trusted. That evening, as sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, Travis and Lily walked the observation posts midnight had revealed. At each location they could see for miles, The landscape spread out in all its harsh beauty. Roads were visible from every vantage point, approaches trackable long before they became threats. Standing at the eastern observation post, Travis noticed something he'd missed before. A glint of metal barely visible among the rocks. He climbed down carefully and found a pair of binoculars, military-grade and weathered but still functional. They'd been positioned to watch the main road from town, and when Travis looked through them he could see vehicles clearly from at least 3 miles away. His uncle had thought of everything. The observation posts weren't just theoretical, they'd been equipped with actual surveillance tools. Travis wondered how many nights Ray had stood at these positions, watching for threats, protecting what he'd claimed as a trust rather than an asset. As they returned to the bunkhouse, midnight fell into step beside them. The horse moved with purpose, no longer the wary wild animal Travis had first encountered. The relationship had shifted, transformed by shared experience and growing understanding. Midnight wasn't just accepting their presence. He was actively partnering with them, teaching them what Ray had taught him. That night Travis made another entry in his own journal, continuing the record his uncle had started. He documented Dale's visit, the observation posts, the discoveries of the past week. He was building his own understanding while preserving the knowledge for whoever might come after him, creating the same continuity Ray had established. Before sleep, he stepped outside one final time. The stars were sharp and cold overhead, the moon just rising. Midnight stood near the canyon rim as he had for several nights, perfectly still, watching. Travis joined him there, both of them looking out over land that held more secrets than either fully understood. "What else do you know?" Travis asked quietly. "What else did Ray teach you?" The horse turned his head, dark eyes reflecting moonlight. For a moment Travis could have sworn he saw intelligence there that transcended animal awareness, something older and deeper than simple training could explain. Then Midnight returned his attention to the canyon, resuming his vigil. Travis stood with him for a while longer, feeling the weight of inheritance settle more comfortably across his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know how to fight the battles that were surely coming. But he had a daughter finding her voice, a community beginning to form, and a horse that carried decades of knowledge in its bones and behavior. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of sage and stone and distant water. From the canyon came the call of a night bird, answered by another somewhere in the darkness. The land was alive in ways Travis was only beginning to perceive, and his place within it was being revealed one discovery at a time. He went inside finally, leaving Midnight to his watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new tests of his commitment. But tonight he knew with certainty that he'd made the right choice. To stay, to protect, to learn what his uncle had known and pass it forward. Some inheritances couldn't be measured in dollars. Some legacies were written in the language of stone and water and the wisdom of animals that remembered what humans forgot. And some gifts came wrapped in hardship, their value revealed only to those who chose to see beyond immediate circumstance to lasting truth. Travis Brennan was beginning to see, and in seeing was beginning to understand what it meant to be worthy of what he'd been given. The journey had only started, but already he was different than the desperate man who'd arrived at a broken gate with nothing but debt and a frightened daughter. He was becoming what the land needed, what his uncle had hoped for, what Midnight had been waiting to find. A guardian, a defender, a keeper of secrets that mattered more than any fortune pulled from the ground. The discovery in the canyon chamber had occupied Travis's thoughts for days, but he knew documentation alone wouldn't protect the property. He needed to understand the full legal landscape, needed to know exactly what rights he held and what vulnerabilities existed. That meant a trip back to the county records office in Sheridan Falls, this time armed with specific questions and his uncle's meticulous notes. Beth agreed to watch Lily for the day, and Travis made the drive alone in the early morning cold. The courthouse was quiet when he arrived, the records clerk the same woman who'd helped him before. She recognized him immediately, her expression shifting to something like sympathy when he explained what he needed. Water rights and mineral claims going back to territorial days? She shook her head slowly. That's going to take some digging. Most of those old records aren't digitized, and the filing systems changed about 6 times over the years. could take hours. I've got hours, Travis said. She led him to a basement room that smelled of old paper and mildew, walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves holding ledger books bound in cracking leather. This is everything from 1870 through 1950, she explained. After that, it's upstairs in a different section. You'll want to start with the territorial land grants, then work forward through the mining district records. Travis spent the morning buried in documents that crumbled at the edges when he turned pages. The handwriting varied from elegant copperplate to barely legible scrawl. The ink faded to brown, the paper foxed with age. But slowly, painstakingly, he began to piece together the property's history. The land that became Broken Pine Ranch had been claimed in 1878 by a man named Samuel Garrett, who'd filed for water rights under the prior appropriation doctrine that governed Western water law. Those rights had been grandfathered through every subsequent owner, unbroken chain stretching back nearly 150 years. In water-scarce Wyoming, senior water rights were gold, and the Broken Pine rights were among the most senior in the entire basin. The silver claim was more complicated. It had been filed in 1891 by the Silver Creek Mining Company, a consortium of investors from back east. Initial surveys had been conducted, mineral samples taken, everything documented properly according to territorial law. But then, inexplicably, the claim had been abandoned without formal closure. It had simply gone dormant, the company dissolving and the paperwork forgotten. Except it hadn't been forgotten by everyone. Travis found a notation from 1982, a transfer document filed by Raymond Brennan claiming the dormant mineral rights under abandonment provisions of federal mining law. His uncle had researched the claim, verified its dormant status, and legally acquired rights that everyone else had assumed were lost to history. It was brilliant and it was airtight. Ray owned not just the land and water, but the mineral deposits beneath, all properly documented and legally secured. No one could challenge the claims without proving continuous use by another party, and the records showed no such use for over 90 years. But there was more. As Travis dug deeper, he found correspondence files, letters between his uncle and various attorneys, county officials, and development companies. Victoria Castellano's name appeared repeatedly, her offers growing more aggressive over the years, her tactics shifting from simple purchase attempts to legal maneuvering and political pressure. One letter from 2018 stopped Travis cold. It was from Castellano's legal team to the county commissioners, arguing that the water rights should be subject to reallocation because they weren't being used for beneficial purposes at maximum capacity. The letter claimed that Ray was hoarding water that could support economic development, that his refusal to share or sell was contrary to public interest. Ray's response was attached, a detailed rebuttal citing case law and hydrological surveys. He'd proven that the canyon water was being used beneficially, supporting wildlife corridors and maintaining ecosystem balance that prevented erosion and protected downstream water quality. He'd turned Castellano's own argument against her, showing that preservation was itself a beneficial use under modern environmental law. The exchange continued for months, Castellano's lawyers probing for weaknesses, Ray's responses growing more technical and irrefutable. Eventually, the county had ruled in Ray's favor, but the final letter in the file carried a handwritten note in the margin in Ray's distinctive script. She won't stop. Victory now just means she'll come harder later. Need to ensure documentation survives me. Need to ensure someone understands what's at stake. Travis sat back, the weight of realization pressing down. His uncle had known he was dying, had known Castellano would return once he was gone, and had prepared accordingly. The journals, the hidden documents, the training of midnight to reveal secrets, all of it was Ray's way of passing on not just property but the knowledge and tools needed to defend it. He photographed every relevant document with his phone, building a digital archive that duplicated his uncle's paper trail. By the time he finished, afternoon light was slanting through the basement windows and his back was screaming in protest from hours bent over ancient ledgers. The clerk helped him make official copies of the most crucial documents, certifying them with county seals that would make them admissible in court. As she worked, she spoke quietly without looking at him directly. Your uncle came in here at least once a month for years. Always polite, always knew exactly what he needed. He taught me more about old land law than I learned in any training. She handed him the certified copies. Victoria Castellano was in here last week. Asked about the same records you've been reviewing. I told her they were public record, couldn't refuse access. But I thought you should know. Travis felt ice settle in his stomach. What did she take? Copies of the property deeds and water rights. Same as you. But she spent extra time on the mineral surveys from the 1890s. Had a mining engineer with her, someone who knew what to look for in those old reports. So she knows about the silver. The clerk met his eyes finally. If she didn't before, she does now. And that changes everything. Water rights she can challenge through allocation arguments. But mineral rights, especially valuable ones, she can't take legally. Which means she'll look for other methods. The drive back to Broken Pine felt longer than usual, Travis's mind racing through possibilities and threats. If Castellano knew about the silver, she'd recognize that simple legal maneuvering wouldn't work. She'd need Travis to sell willingly or find some way to force him off the property entirely. The tactics would escalate, become more personal, more dangerous. He arrived at the ranch to find Dale Pritchard's truck parked near the bunkhouse, the rancher standing with Beth and Lily near the corral where Midnight grazed. They turned as Travis approached, their expressions serious. "We've got a problem," Dale said without preamble. "Surveyors showed up this afternoon. 3 trucks, professional crew, heading for the canyon. Beth spotted them from the feed store and called me. I got here in time to turn them back at the gate, but they weren't happy about it." "Did they say who hired them?" "Didn't have to. Trucks had Castellano Development logos on the doors." Dale's jaw was tight with anger. They claimed they had legal right to assess mineral deposits on federal land. Tried to argue that the mining claim was on BLM property, not private. Travis felt rage building. "That's a lie. The claim is entirely within the property boundaries. I just verified it at the courthouse." I told them that, Dale said. Showed them the survey maps Ray kept at the observation posts. They backed off but said they'd return with proper authorization. He looked at Travis steadily. "This is just the opening move. She's testing to see if you know what you have and if you're willing to defend it." Beth stepped forward, her expression fierce. "Half the town knows what's happening by now. Castellano's been too aggressive for too long. People are tired of her buying up everything and changing the character of the basin. You stand firm, you won't stand alone." Travis looked at his daughter, who was watching the adults with worried eyes. Then at Midnight, who had lifted his head from grazing and was staring toward the main gate as if sensing lingering threat. Everything his uncle had built, everything Travis was learning to value, was under direct attack now. The battle Ray had fought for decades was passing to him whether he was ready or not. "I need to talk to a lawyer," Travis said. "Someone who understands water rights and mining law. Someone Castellano can't intimidate or buy off." Dale nodded. "There's a firm in Cheyenne, Brennan and Associates. No relation to your uncle, just coincidence of names. They've fought Castellano before, know her tactics. Won't be cheap though." Money was always the problem, Travis thought bitterly. He had legal rights and moral standing and community support, but defending those things required resources he didn't possess. The irony wasn't lost on him that a fortune in silver sat beneath his feet while he couldn't afford basic legal counsel. That evening, after Dale and Beth had left and Lily was asleep, Travis sat at the table with all his documentation spread before him. The certified copies from the courthouse, his uncle's journals, the photographs of the silver or samples, the survey maps showing observation posts and property boundaries. Together they told a story of value worth protecting and forces determined to take it. Midnight appeared at the window, dark face pressed against the glass, breath fogging the pane. Travis went outside and stood with the horse under stars that seemed close enough to touch. The night air was cold enough to burn, the silence so complete that the sound of his own breathing seemed loud. "I don't know if I can do this," Travis admitted quietly. "Fight someone with money and lawyers and political connections. I'm just a broke cowboy who can barely keep the lights on." The horse turned his head, one dark eye reflecting starlight as he regarded Travis with that uncanny intelligence. Then Midnight did something he'd never done before. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead against Travis's chest, directly over his heart. The gesture was unmistakable, deliberate, a bond acknowledged, partnership affirmed. Travis wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, feeling the solid warmth of muscle and bone, the steady pulse of life beating beneath dusty hide. Whatever came next, whatever battles had to be fought, he wouldn't face them alone. He had Lily finding strength in this harsh place. He had allies beginning to gather. He had knowledge his uncle had spent decades accumulating. And he had Midnight, guardian of secrets and witness to truths that transcended simple ownership. The wind shifted, carrying sounds from the canyon, water moving over stone, life persisting in hostile country through adaptation and resilience. Travis understood now what his uncle had known, that some things were worth more than their market value, that real wealth was measured in clean water and wild spaces and the freedom to choose principle over profit. He would call the lawyers in Cheyenne tomorrow, would begin building a legal defense with money he'd have to borrow or beg, would prepare for confrontation with an opponent who had every advantage except one. Castellano wanted this land for what it could give her. Travis wanted it for what it was, for what it represented, for the legacy it carried and the future it could sustain. That difference mattered. That difference was everything. And in the battles ahead, it might be the only advantage that truly counted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.